Welcome to Speaking of Business, conversations with Canadian innovators, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. I'm Goldie Hyder, President and CEO of the Business Council of Canada. Today, I'm speaking with John Manley, Canada's former Industry Minister, Finance Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Deputy Prime Minister. John recently stepped down after 9 years in the job I now hold as head of the Business Council. As you'll hear, John's commitment to his family, career, and public service in both politics and business is truly remarkable. Here's our conversation. I hope you'll enjoy. John, thanks so much for joining me.
I'm happy to be here.
How are you?
I couldn't be better because the burden of responsibility has been lifted from my shoulders and put on yours.
Well, thank you, I think. You know, when I took the position at the Business Council, I knew I had big shoes to fill. But you know what surprised me the most? You're a celebrity. I've been with you in the last 24 hours as we traveled around, and pilot stops and says, "Thank you for your public service." Walking into this building here, a guy screams out, "You don't look like the guy who's retiring." How does that feel after all these years?
Well, I've always thought as long as they wave with 5 fingers, it's not so bad. And so what I would say is anyone that says public service is a thankless task is wrong. I've had lots of thanks and lots of approbation from people. Now, during an election campaign, when your name is on the ballot, different rules apply, and people will say anything to you, and some of it can be quite hurtful, I'd say. But the rest of the time, I've found that Canadians have been very grateful for what they perceive to be a difficult job.
Do you think our politics has changed from the time that you entered it and where we are now?
Well, there's different pressures for sure. I think the phenomenon of social media, which I didn't have to deal with, has changed the dimensions quite a bit. In my time, the more recent phenomenon was 24/7 news cycle. And that in itself changed the way the political game was played. So you no longer had to gear up for the deadlines that newspapers and electronic media had later in the afternoon. You were always on all the time. But I think social media is a whole other dimension. But the other thing, Goldie, that I think has changed a little bit is one always worries about becoming a curmudgeon and as one ages, but it just seems to me that the adversarial nature has become a lot more personal and a lot nastier. I had friends, I still have friends that were political opponents. They weren't my enemies. I didn't hate them. We had a different point of view on some things. And truthfully, in opposition, I was there for 5 years. You oppose because that's your responsibility. But in fact, you probably agree with, 75% of what a government is doing, because there's not that wide a margin of difference over many things. And now I get the sense that it's not just opposition in order to draw out the weaknesses or explain other points of view. It's a bitter personal rivalry in which it's all politics all the time. I think that's really regrettable. I guess I preferred the notion that we were all in this to try to get the best outcomes for Canadians, and it didn't really matter what, color tie you were wearing.
Would you run today, knowing what you know?
Well, would I run today if I were 38 years old again? It'd be a different answer than it would be today.
Let's say you are 38 years old. Would you run?
Well, I've talked about it with my kids, of course, and I wouldn't encourage them to run.
Isn't that sad?
It is, because I do believe in public service. I remember being out in the car with my oldest daughter, so she was 9. And we're out driving around. She says, do you like your new job? I said, yeah, I really enjoy it. I'm getting to do really interesting things. And she said, you work more than you did in your old job. I said, yeah, probably I do. It's long hours and, with over the Christmas period that year, we had votes that went well into the night. She said, "Do you get paid more than in your old job?" I said, "Well, actually, no, I get paid less." Then there's a long pause, and she says, "Why did you do this?" There's a learning opportunity, teaching opportunity. I lived as part of a government which in some ways was charmed. I went into government out of opposition with Mr. Chrétien in 1993. He made me Minister of Industry. I held the job 7 years. If you go over to industry, what was Industry Canada, to the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Ministry, and look at the pictures on the wall, there's a lot of them. There's all those various ministries. And my view is they should be sized according to how long you were there, because mine would be basically poster size and a lot of the others would be postage stamps. Because I was there a long time. 7 years, I think, is the longest since World War II that anyone's been there. But in those 7 years, I think the Prime Minister called me 5 times. I ran my department. I made decisions. Some of them were difficult. Some of them were controversial. So, I had free reign. I don't think that happens anymore.
Let's talk more about leadership. It's certainly a passion of mine to learn from others. What have you learned from your political leaders that you've had, but also the fact that you've now had a line of sight into Canada's business leaders for the last 9 years?
Well, they come in all shapes and sizes, of course. And usually business leaders often don't make very good political leaders because they don't. Yeah. Well, because businesses, I know there's a great anecdote about George Shultz, who was, renowned as being both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States. So finance minister and foreign affairs minister, like me, right? Yeah. But he also ran a university. And he also ran a major corporation, Bechtel Corporation. And he was asked one time, which was the hardest? And he said, it's much harder to run a corporation. And the interviewer said, well, why is that? And he said, well, because unlike government or universities, in a corporation, when you tell people to do something, they actually do it. So you're responsible for it. But it gives you an idea of the structure. I mean, in the corporate structure, if you're the boss, you make the decisions and people execute them. In government, and I guess in universities, I've never worked in the universities, it's not quite like that. You have to build consensus. You have to get others to see things your way. You have to get things to work. I used to say taking a memorandum to cabinet forward was like organizing one of those, races at a Sunday school picnic where everybody's got their legs tied together and you've got to try to get them all moving in the same kind of sequence. Otherwise, everyone falls over. It's a little bit like that in government. It's not intuitive for a business person who thinks they can go in and run it like a business. Well, running it like a business means that you just ignore what your colleagues, what stakeholders have to say in many cases.
Let's return to the leadership theme and talk about when you were growing up. Who are the leaders that you admired? Who did you read about? So many people say, I read Churchill. But who were your folks that you looked up to and thought, that's leadership?
Well, I'd put it this way. I grew up in an Irish-Canadian household where we couldn't have dinner without having a discussion about politics. And my dad tended to support the Liberals, and my mother tended to support the Conservatives. I can remember they would sometimes even have both signs on the lawn. And if you didn't have a good argument over dinner, then what was the point of sitting together? Right. So and I think a lot of Irish families are a little bit
surprised
like that.
You didn't become an NDPer in that house.
Some people on both sides say I should have been the other way. I don't know. I think the underlying theme in those years, even though my parents might disagree, was that people in positions of political leadership deserved respect. This was public service. And they would never have said that the other side was not worthy of respect. So I grew up believing that public service was really an important thing. So my first awareness was Diefenbaker coming to power and Lester Pearson being awarded the Nobel Prize and then being the leader of the opposition and later being elected. In the days you'll never forget where you were and what you were doing, I was writing my grade 9 math exam on the 22nd of November, 1963, when JFK was assassinated. That was profoundly moving for me and for all of my contemporaries. I mean, that was a big, big event. And then, I went through high school and into university in the years of Vietnam. So it was a very politically active time. The day in 1968 that Pierre Trudeau was chosen leader of the Federal Liberal Party in April 1968 was the weekend that Martin Luther King had been assassinated in Memphis, and cities across the United States were going up in flames. And we had this shiny new leader that was intellectual and cool, and the U.S. was going up in smoke. And it just felt like the action was important. The loss of important leaders in the United States stood in stark contrast to the emergence of this brilliant new leader in Canada. And weren't we proud to be Canadians? Of course, that was just after Expo 67 and the Canadian Centennial as well. So it was, to say I grew up in a political environment, even though nobody in my family ever ran for office, would be an understatement.
So why did you run? When that day came, you said, I think I'm going to do this. What motivated you to do it?
Rocking chair test. I had this notion, Goldie, that you don't regret the things you did as much as you regret the things you didn't do. And there I was, a Liberal sympathizer, I'd say, more than a Liberal partisan. And Brian Mulroney had a massive majority. And I practiced law for 10 years. I had a family. I had 3 children. They were, when I was first elected, 9, 6, and 1. But I thought, I don't want to be sitting in my rocking chair one day thinking, I always wanted to try that. I wonder what would have happened if I'd done it. And so, when a massive Conservative majority means that there are nominations that you can try to get. And that's, in Canadian politics, I'll tell you, by far the hardest thing is to get a nomination. Once you've got a nomination, well, then it's the national campaign that's going to carry you in or cause you to lose. So I thought, well, I'll throw my hat in the ring. And I worked hard, and I sold memberships and all the things that you do. It's very, very grassroots. Got all my friends and colleagues to volunteer, and surprised won a nomination. In that election, Ottawa South was a new constituency. I remember the Financial Post ran a special segment on Ottawa South, and they featured it because they thought it was a really interesting contest between an incumbent Conservative, Barry Turner, and a union leader, very prominent union leader named John Fryer. They wrote the whole article, didn't mention the Liberal candidate. So I felt pretty good on election day when Fryer didn't get 15% of the vote and I won. I had more than half the votes the first time out. But it was, to me, it was an opportunity to be in public service.
So is John Manley's life one that's been lived without regret?
Oh, no. Are you kidding? I mean, I've got lots of mistakes and lots
That's
of things.
That's different. Regrets and mistakes are different. Any regrets?
Regrets. I wouldn't say major regrets, no. in some ways, I look back. It's not over, by the way.
No, we're
it's
coming
not
to
a
that.
retrospective, but it's not over. But I don't look back on my life experiences as being things that I regret. I mean, there were opportunities. I had great opportunities, some of which I didn't follow. I was a law clerk to the Chief Justice of Canada. I could have gone to Harvard or to Oxford or something, and at that time in my life, I'd really had my fill of school and decided not to. Kind of wish I'd done one of those things, but I don't put that in the category of great regrets. I've had a really wonderful experience. I have 3 kids who are all married and in careers of their own. None have ever called me from the jail. They'd
say you're a good dad?
You'd have to ask them that. They would.
Are you a good dad?
They would probably say their mom was a good dad because so many of those years I had to be absent, and Judith had to really keep things together. And they had dinner at home. They'd say, "Where's Dad tonight?" And she'd say, "He's working for Canada." So, she deserves the credit for them.
How important has her role been in your life?
Well, she's a rock, right? She's totally reliable. She has foregone. She's a smart woman.
But you held it together. So many marriages fall apart when you enter public life, it feels like. But you guys are an example of getting it right. Your family's a solid family. You and Judith are in great place.
Well, what I tend to say is, some people have lived together a long time, but married less. In our case, we've been married for 45 years and we've lived together for 20. So maybe that's what works.
Distance makes the heart grow fonder, is it?
Yeah, but as I say, she's smart. She's got opinions. She knows lots of things, and she basically forwent all of the opportunities that she could have pursued. She was a feminist before I'd ever heard the word. But she took the back seat so that I could do lots of neat things, and I don't think she regrets it. But I think that she had to. She had to set her expectations at a certain level in order to give our family what she believed was essential. Not everybody makes the same choice in those circumstances, but in our case. She stayed home, and they say the notion that a parent needs to be around when the kids are little. I think that's probably true, but you know what? It's when they're getting into their preteens and teens, and those hours when they get home from school. That's when you find out what's really going on, and I think that she had, that special intuition to know what was going on in each of their lives. And it's not always easy with preteens and teens, but we got through it all.
Now, in politics, they often say that you need to have a counterbalance. And in many cases, that is your spouse. It doesn't have to be. Prime ministers like to have what they call a kitchen cabinet, people that they can speak to and reach out to just to get a reality check. Did you have that?
Well, to a great degree, I did, yes, for sure, at home. And also, I spent a lot of time.
Tell us more about that, though. Did Judith ever say to you, John, I watched you today, and that was an embarrassing performance in question period?
No, she would never do that. She wouldn't do that. She'd never be negative. But she would ask about things and how we were explaining them. And but she was always supportive.
Now, we've talked about how politics often came at great sacrifice. But, you weren't a politician 7/24. John Manley is still a person. How did you pass your time, and how did you unwind from a really difficult day? What did you do?
Well, in my years in government, I actually took up running in a serious way. And
not for office, you mean, but
not for office. I ran for office too, but I had a staff member, Dan May, who was a very avid runner, and university competitive and stuff, and talked to him one day about it. He said, well, let's get a good pair of running shoes and I'll give you some tips and things. I said, I've always had this notion that I'd like to run a marathon. And I think he kind of rolled his eyes and said he got me this website, halhigdon.com, and I followed it religiously. And I celebrated turning 50 by running my first marathon here in Ottawa. And it turned out to be a really good thing to do as a minister, because it gave me time when I was running to think through things with nobody throwing anything at me. And the thing about a minister's job is that you're never alone. There's always, even when you're in the car, somebody's driving you, and there's staff with you, and there are people that want things, and your calendar is full from early morning till late at night. And when I got out for a run, I was alone. Now, there were times when I had to have security, but not often in Canada. And over the course of those years, I ran 5 marathons. I ran some halves and 10Ks and just had a great experience of it. It was it kept me healthy. It gave me time to think. And it was a release from the pressure, from the stress.
We'll come back to the hobbies because I want to ask about that, but you just said something I want to pick up on. You had to have security. Why?
I had security when I was foreign minister and there was a war going on in Afghanistan. And I had security when I was deputy prime minister and somewhere on the road. And I often thought it was...
Were there any threats against you?
They don't tell you if there are threats.
But when security arrived, did you feel like, wow?
Yes, it was very intrusive. And it was things like, please don't leave your house unless you call us in advance. Because they didn't want to have somebody parked there all the time, but they didn't want me going out, to buy the groceries. So, for the run, they'd have an officer on a bicycle that would, sometimes 2, that would come along with me. And I remember one time I was in Vancouver and I was going to run the seawall, and I had this RCMP officer, Marie Claire was her name. And I said, look, I'm going to have all my gear on, hat, sunglasses. Nobody's going to recognize me. And what are they going to do to me anyway? And she said, I'm really sorry, but I have to go with you. Besides, you just never know. So we're going down that first turn past, I think it's the West End, into Stanley Park, and somebody running the other way, and I'm totally geared up, right? Sunglasses, hat down. Guy running the other way says, "Good morning, Mr. Manley." And I hear the RCMP officer over my shoulder saying, See? I told you. Yeah. I said, he didn't try to attack me. He just said, good morning.
Well, look, one of the things about, being a minister or being a CEO is it's a job title. But then you come home and your dad, your husband, your grandpa, what was that like? And the reality check that comes when it says, you may be the minister, but I still need the garbage taken out.
Well, actually, what we did in our household is we referred to the minister in the third person. Because when I was at home, I was not the minister. The minister was somebody. The minister had a car. The minister had an office. The minister brought briefcases in. But I was not that. I was not that persona. I was
He was left
me.
at the door. Yeah.
Yeah. And, every Saturday morning I made breakfast. And, yes, I took the garbage out. That was one of my things until I could bribe my children to do it, which is not easy to do. Cut the grass. I'm not a very good gardener. I remember one time I was deputy prime minister. I'm standing out on my front lawn in Alta Vista in Ottawa, and it's a mess. I think we had some kind of white grub infestation or something, and I'm trying to figure it. And my neighbor next door, Colin, comes over, and we're standing there looking at this scene of devastation. It looked like it was, had been a nuclear waste site or something. And he says, tell me, does the Vice President of the United States have a lawn that looks like this? I said, no, and he doesn't cut his own grass either.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. You set a goal for running a marathon and you did it. Are there any more marathons in your future?
Well, the next thing I did after the marathon was because I had an injury which inhibited my running, which I regret a lot. But anyway, I climbed Kilimanjaro as a fundraiser for Care Canada, which is an international relief charity that I was involved with for many years. And I loved it. It was an extraordinary experience. The only regret that I had was I thought, my kids really need to see this. So I started talking to them about, would you be interested in doing this? And of course, they all said they would. And it took a few years. And then my two girls said at one point, they said, look, it's a great idea, but our biological clocks are ticking here. And if we don't do this soon, then we're going to run out of time because you can't take kids up on Kilimanjaro till they're, 10 at least. So we found a time. It was over Christmas, 2013, and my three kids, two girls and a boy, and their partners, and two other friends, and me, made a group. And we went to Kilimanjaro, and we climbed to the summit. And it was the most extraordinary experience. I mean, you get your adult kids for 9 days with no phones.
There's the magic right there.
Nothing to do but walk and talk and eat and sleep. And in this remarkable environment, because you climb Kilimanjaro, you go through 7 different distinct climate zones. It's everything from tropical rainforest with monkeys hanging in the trees through to, the heathery districts.
What's your best memory from there?
Getting down. No, it was there were many great memories. I mean, we just had a wonderful time together, and it was over Christmas, and our guiding company decided, they called me a few weeks in advance of the trip and said, does your family celebrate Christmas? I said, oh, yeah, it's kind of a big deal in our household. So they made every effort. They had, stockings on our tents on Christmas morning. They had one of the porters who was a very, very dark African and a very, very thin man wearing a Santa outfit. They sang Christmas songs to us, the porters did. They made an exception and had a little bit of rum in the eggnog even for us. So they made a special event of it. So that was very memorable.
The best of humanity at work.
Because I was clearly the senior of the group, in Swahili they called me Babu.
Babu, yeah.
Yeah. So in fact, my girls' concerns proved warranted because within a year of our descent, I had 2 grandsons. So in search of an appropriate grandfather name, they settled on Babu because it's the Kilimanjaro connection. So that's an ongoing legacy.
Well, speaking of ongoing legacies, Babu, to me, when you run a marathon and you climb Kilimanjaro and do things like that, it can really help you prepare for adversity in your life. Have you had adversity in your life, and how did those experiences help you?
Well, if I could take the year 2017 out of my life, the answer would be pretty much no. But
we can't.
We can't. So we have a cottage in the Rideau Lakes, roughly halfway between Kingston and Ottawa. And it's not a long-time family cottage. I couldn't afford a cottage when I was in public life, but after I was out, we bought this place in 2006, and it became a family place, a gathering place. We were there a lot. And we went for New Year's in 2016, December 30th. We were up there. It was, like many families, it wasn't It wasn't a Manley Christmas. It was the in-laws' Christmas. So we had everybody for Christmas over New Year's. And December 30th, I went to bed and was sound asleep when my son-in-law started calling out that there was a fire. So I got up and saw that this was not anything that my little hand-operated fire extinguisher was going to deal with. And I called out to everybody, get dressed and get out and grab anything you think is valuable on the way. We had 5 minutes to get out, and the place was engulfed.
Cold winter day?
It was about minus 20 outside. We had 6 adults, one of the grandsons, 2 years old, and a dog. We got everybody out, grabbed a few things off the walls. Somebody even opened the refrigerator and grabbed the turkey, threw it out in the snow, and then we just watched it burn down. So that was December 30th, 2016. And then it takes a few months for the insurance company to do all their, to do all of their evaluations. And the day that they had given the clearance and the equipment was there to begin the demolition, the whole thing had to come down. All that was left was the foundation. The day the demolition began, my sister died. She was my older sister, my only sibling, and she died of liver disease that had been caused by a condition called hemochromatosis, which is too much iron in the blood. So then I go to my doctor and says, I've been reading about this, hemochromatosis, hereditary effects. Should I be tested? He said, I don't think you've got hemochromatosis from your blood test, but I'll send you to a hematologist. I go, hematologist. He says, same thing, but let's get an ultrasound and see what's going on in your liver. So May 1st, 2017, I get an ultrasound. May 2nd, I called and said, your liver looks just fine. You got a mass on your kidney. We got to check it out. So it turns out I have 2 tumors on my left kidney. And next thing I know, we're scheduling surgery to remove a kidney. Fortunately, kidneys come in pairs and there's built-in redundancy. So I can function just fine with one, getting lots of monitoring. But I'd say, have I dealt with adversity? That was not my finest year between the fire and the loss that entailed, my sister, and the cancer diagnosis. That's not my best year.
Well, they say adversity builds character, and it's clear that that's happened. I'm still here, and I have a whole enhanced appreciation for good health that I wouldn't say I ever took it for granted, but I never was sick. I never even had symptoms from the cancer. I had 2 plenty big tumors, but so far I had no symptoms. So sickness is not something that I've ever been able to really compute for myself, other than the odd, cold or flu or something. So it's not a bad experience to know what it's like to come out the other side.
Yeah, and to be in a hospital bed and to see what happens on the inside of our healthcare system. And I'll tell you, I know there's lots of griping, complaining, and I think if you've got elective surgeries or other special treatments, it can take a long time. But when you've got something serious, oh man, our system is good.
That's when it really works. As
I like to say to my American friends, it was fast, it was efficient, it was very good, and the only thing I had to pay for was parking at the hospital. Now, that was not inconsequential, I might add, but that's all I paid.
Now, you've had an interesting perch and somewhat of a hybrid in the golf bag, if you will. You've seen the political side. You're getting a line of sight into the business side. There's often a tension between our political folks and our business community. Are they really that different?
One of the things that I think that my political colleagues, when I was there, would not have appreciated as much as I've learned it to be the case, is the degree to which our senior business leaders, members of the Business Council of Canada, really do want to see Canada succeed. Now, they all lead big businesses. They're all very competitive. They're all very well compensated, as everybody will know. But they are philanthropic. They are community leaders. They give time, which is something they generally don't have, to community and other causes. And they really do believe in Canada and in Canadian success. So I think one of the great things about serving at the Business Council has been when we're advocating for good public policy that supports economic growth, it's always from the context of not how do we make a certain class of people rich. It's about how do we make Canada a better place for us and for our children and grandchildren. And that is not an attitude that most political actors attribute to business leaders. They think that, I think this is maybe unfair to some, but they tend to think that they are self-centered and greedy.
I've heard you describe the role that you played at the Business Council as one of an interpreter, of trying to help build a bridge between business and government. What advice do you have for me as we go forward and how to continue to be that interpreter?
I think a good starting point is to say we're not here to oppose government. We're here to work with government. And I think that that to be constructive is way more valuable than to be critical. Now, sometimes you have to be critical, and sometimes they're really not listening. And sometimes if you're not critical, they interpret your lack of criticism as acquiescence. So it's a bit of a tricky thing. But I think that our role has been historically one of not just advocacy, but thought leadership. Because generally speaking, all Canadians believe that they want to see our economy grow. They want to see good jobs. They want to see incomes rise. They want to alleviate poverty. They want to see good health. They want to see a clean environment. They want to see us play a constructive leadership role in the world. And those are things that business leaders and political leaders agree on. So we've got lots of common ground to work with, and I would focus on the common ground before I focused on the things on which we find we must disagree.
Do you have concerns about our economy? Do you have concerns about rising deficits, debt? I mean, you were finance minister.
What I worry about, when you look at our overall debt level in Canada at the federal level, it's not worrisome. I don't think
under low interest rate environment, maybe not, but they're going the other direction.
It's a low interest rate, but also our debt as a percentage of our GDP isn't bad. But
who talks
better.
Like that, John, at the dinner table? Do you think anybody talks like that?
Hold on. So I think that that's sort of what the government says to us, right? So don't worry, be happy. But what worries me is that over the last number of years, we have seen deficits growing way faster than the economy is growing. I've seen that movie. And then, as you say, interest rates start to rise. And, the low-cost debt suddenly is becoming more expensive. And, by the way, people like getting all those goodies. And all of a sudden, we're in a situation where the economy slows it could be global reasons, and growth slows, and government revenues slow, but the expenditure base remains the same. In fact, it grows because of employment insurance benefits and other offsets. So suddenly what was a manageable deficit and a relatively low debt is growing exponentially and really fast. And it's really hard to do anything about it. When the Great Recession hit in 2008, The federal government in Canada had run 12 consecutive surpluses. We were a paradigm of virtue in fiscal terms. So the Canadian government, and I give the Harper government credit for this, opened the taps. Our stimulus in Canada, in absolute numbers, not relative numbers, was the fourth largest in the world, like our military was after World War II. It was big. Like, we spent a lot of money. And we didn't come out unscathed, but we came out a lot better than most of the world. Our highly regulated financial institutions, none of them required bailout by the government. No federal money flowed to them. It flowed to infrastructure and other things. Central banks did what they did. Most of them, this gets a little technical, most of them expanded their balance sheets by doing something called quantitative easing. Didn't do it in Canada. Didn't need to. Lowered the interest rates, but the Bank of Canada wasn't out buying government debt or buying corporate debt as other central banks, including the Federal Reserve, were doing. We came through that really well. Why? Because we'd run 12 surpluses in good times so that we had our cupboards full when bad times came. What are we doing now? We're in good times and we're pouring the money out the door. So I just think that's a prescription for disaster. And whoever's in government, when the turn comes, because it will come, they're going to have some challenging things to decide. Something I worry about when people talk about the economy and they say highest ever or lowest ever, I figure it's time to run for the hills because you know what? Trees do not grow to the sky.
Well, speaking of running for the hills, as we wind up, I thought I'd play a little word game with you. I'm going to give you one word and you're going to give me the first word that comes to mind. Trump.
Tower.
Putin.
Poison.
China.
Opportunity.
Chrétien.
Pragmatism.
Harper.
Ideology.
Social media.
Opportunity.
Judith.
I love her.
That's 3 words. How about Canada?
I love Canada. We all focus on what, especially in the jobs that I've had and that you're entering, what can we do better? So sometimes that sounds like criticisms. But, there's nobody living here that was either born here or that immigrated here that didn't win the lottery. This is still, the greatest place on
Heaven
earth.
on earth. Well, you've made it a better country through your service, John, and I know there's more that lies ahead for you. I can't tell you what a privilege and an honor it is to try and fill your shoes. You're leaving behind a great organization with a great team and a really solid membership, and I think you'll be happy to know that we're all going to work very hard to keep Canada strong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to John Manley for being my guest on this episode of Speaking of Business. Subscribe now for more conversations with Canada's top innovators, entrepreneurs, and business leaders. Search Speaking of Business wherever you find podcasts or visit speakingofbiz.ca to join our email list and follow us on social media. Until next time, I'm Goldie Hyder.